Avengers Endgame ended in tears and tears in the fabric of space-time as Captain America embarked on one final mysterious mission back in time that left us with so many questions about the timeline of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, did Cap make Jane Foster drink angry Reality Stone sludge? Did Cap spend decades slow dancing with Peggy Carter while his best friend was tortured and brainwashed in Siberia? And if time travel isn't supposed to cause changes to your own timeline, why did Cap age into Clint Eastwood? Like Tony Stark says in Avengers Endgame, when you mess with time and it messes back with you and makes you never want to meet your heroes again. But after I watched Endgame several times, I think I actually figured out what happens in that off-screen mission, how it changes the MCU timeline, and how it actually sets up the future of Marvel in a pretty cool way, and still make you like Captain America even more. Spoiler warning if you haven't seen Endgame yet, though I guess I've already said a lot about it. Hey, Joe Russo said it's okay to talk about it. Okay, so about halfway through the film, the Ancient One tells Banner that the Avengers can steal each of the Infinity Stones in their time heist, but they must return them because removing any of them permanently would lead to too many chaotic branches to break off from the main timeline. Both the Ancient One and Banner were correct in their descriptions of time travel. Major changes to the past, like stealing Infinity Stones, cause alternate timelines to split off, with that changed branch timeline spiraling off into chaos, and your original timeline to remain unchanged. So after using the stones to beat Thanos in the future, Cap goes alone on one final trip to put them all back. He also takes Thor's previous hammer, Mjolnir, since Thor stole that from the 2013 Dark World timeline, and along with the stones, the hammer needs to go back to restore that timeline back to its original order. But here's where things get a little confusing. Endgame does not show us what Cap did on this final mission, this time gift return. Instead, he just shows up sitting at the lake as an old man, revealing that he stayed in the 1940s, living a beautiful life, and now I guess he's like feeding ducks. This appears to break the movie's own rules about time travel. Like, think about it. If Cap went back to the 1940s and made the major change of himself remaining in the past, that should have caused a new branch timeline to form, separate from the main timeline with Banner, Bucky, and Sam. At first, it looked like they were saying Steve Rogers aged for decades and decades within this timeline, all while his original self went into the ice, came back out in 2011, and fought alongside the Avengers. Two Captain Americas, the one we knew, and a secret creepy older one, hiding in the shadows, saluting America's ass. It also presents all kind of weird ramifications. Like, if Bucky is still standing there at the end of Endgame with his Winter Soldier arm in the present day, that would mean Captain America had spent decades with Peggy, knowing that his best friend was being tortured in Siberia, brainwashed by Hydra. Sorry, I didn't save you, friend. Also, I'm giving my shield to this fella I just met a few years ago. Also, not to get too dark about this, but hey, you brought time travel into the story, we're gonna do this. Cap would have woken up every morning knowing Hydra was infiltrating and corrupting the US government, destabilizing the world through terrorism and war. Like, I get it, Cap, get in those 2 steps with Peggy, but you probably could have stopped 9/11. But here is the deal. The directors confirmed that while there were 2 Caps in existence throughout the 20th century, one frozen in ice and avenging with Avengers, one dancing with Peggy, the Cap and Peggy that we see at the end of the movie were in a new separate timeline, an off-screen history. When Cap went back to Peggy, he did create a new branch timeline. The director said that this Cap, as an old man, somehow traveled from that branch timeline back to this one to give Sam his shield. Now, I know, I don't think Pym particles allow you to hop laterally among timelines. I assume you have to go back to the branch point and then go back down that fork in the road. But notice how it is strange that Cap looks so old here. Like, his super soldier serum was supposed to slow down his aging, like it did for Bucky, another super soldier who lived around 100 years but still rocks that mid to late 30s jowlless jawline. This old man Cap might have lived several hundred years into a future when quantum realm technology is refined and multiverse travel is possible without having to go back in time to branch points. And again, we don't know what happened in Cap's alternate branch history. That alternate Cap could have rescued Bucky from Siberia. The 2 of them could have kicked ass throughout 20th century world history, preventing 9/11 left and right. Maybe at some point in this alternate history, Steve Rogers did pass on the Captain America title to Bucky Barnes, since this alternate Bucky wouldn't have been the infamous Winter Soldier. And that could be why Steve now gives the shield to Sam Wilson, because Bucky would have already gotten the chance to be Cap in another life. And in this timeline, it would make more sense for Sam to take on the shield. But Cap's alternate history with Peggy wasn't the only new branch timeline accidentally created by this movie. The original MCU canon history still happened, but now so did a bunch of new stuff. So let's review. What did Cap's final mission fix, and what did it leave broken in a new timeline? First, Time Stone, Power Stone, Mind Stone, Reality Stone, all fixed. It's pretty clear Cap replaced all those stones without incident. Exactly where they had been removed from the timeline, restoring history. He gave the Time Stone back to the Ancient One, he put the Power Stone back in the orb in the Morag Temple, he put the Mind Stone back in Loki's scepter and returned that to the hands of Hydra, Sitwell or Dr. List. Now, that must have been hard for him to do, but it did erase Cap's Hail Hydra moment and prevented any possible partnership between Cap and Hydra. And Cap returned the Reality Stone to Jane Foster in Asgard. Now, I know, it's a bit weird, especially since the Reality Stone changes its state from stone to angry sludge, but presumably he just dropped it on Jane when she was sleeping and the stone cosmically knew to phase shift into sludge and reabsorb back into Jane's body. Second, Mjolnir, previously stolen from 2013 Thor, fixed. Cap brought it with him on his return journey and presumably left it in Asgard with the Reality Stone to prevent a branch timeline where Thor would be left without Mjolnir against the Dark Elves and Ultron. Third, Space Stone, fixed. Cap returned the Space Stone, presumably somehow reconstructing the Tesseract cube and putting it back in storage at Lehigh in 1970, but Loki stealing the Space Stone in 2012, new timeline. To be clear, the branch point of Loki taking the Space Stone and escaping exists separate of the Space Stone's normal history in the main timeline. Loki's whole previous history remains unchanged. Battle of New York, captured, imprisoned on Asgard, faked his death, disguised himself as Odin, the events of Ragnarok, and then his real death by Thanos. All that stuff still happened, but now the Avengers meddling created this branch timeline in which an alternate alive Loki continues to live. Loki is both alive and dead, like the cat of the famous Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, which will henceforth be known as Schrodinger's Loki. Next, the Soul Stone, presumably fixed, but the Soul Stone is unlike the other stones in that it requires a sacrifice, right? This sacrifice cannot be undone, but I think we can assume that the stone can be given back. I suppose it's also possible that Cap kept the Soul Stone, and that break of the timeline resulted in his new life with Peggy, a soul for a soul mate. But let's move on to these stolen Pym particles from 1970. Those are the ones that Cap took from Hank Pym's lab so he and Stark could get back to the present day. This one, to me, is a mystery. I don't know if Cap could have replaced them. They only had so many of those Pym particles, they needed all the ones they took to time travel. But at the end of the movie, Hank Pym was back, so I guess he could have created more Pym particles to replace the ones that were taken. But remember, Hank Pym and Howard Stark have an established history of distrust. We saw that in the opening scene of the first Ant-Man. Pym accused Stark of stealing his research.
You turned me into your errand boy, and now you try to steal my research?
That could have started from Cap stealing the Pym particles in Avengers Endgame in 1970. So maybe Cap never replaced those, and because they weren't Infinity Stones, it just didn't cause a whole branch timeline to break off. But this brings us to the most drastic change of the MCU timeline. Thanos, along with Gamora, Nebula, the Black Order, all of Thanos' forces, in 2014, they all departed from the main timeline, jumping into the future to fight the Avengers in the present day. Gamora switched sides, and then her whereabouts ended up unknown, but all the others ended up dead. In 2014, Nebula was shot by her present-day self, and then the Black Order, all the other forces, and Thanos himself all dusted. So that means, starting in 2014, there is a new branch timeline, a separate alternate history without Thanos, and a timeline in which Peter Quill never met Gamora, and perhaps the Guardians of the Galaxy never came together. But that also means that Nidavellir and Eitri would be left alone, the Gauntlet would never exist, Xandar would live on, the Asgardian refugees after Ragnarok would survive and never get attacked, Loki, Heimdall, Vision, and every other Snap victim would live, no post-Snap 5-year period would transpire, and Steve Rogers, Tony Stark, and Natasha Romanoff would all live on normally. These characters would still kind of hate each other after the events of Civil War, but hey, they'd still be breathing. So I want you to imagine that normal timeline and compare it to the post-apocalyptic timeline in that 5-year gap after Thanos' snap. Many of you brought up that the Ancient One said that the stones were necessary to maintain the flow of space-time. And if in the beginning of Endgame, Thanos used the stones to destroy the stones after he snapped half of everything away, wouldn't that have plunged that main timeline into chaos and disorder? Yeah, and maybe it did. Maybe despite the Avengers bringing all 6 stones into the future to bring back the Snap victims, returning them back to times in history before Thanos destroyed them left this future in a more chaotic, dark place than we thought. Because that timeline still includes Thanos getting the stones, snapping everyone away, and then destroying them. It could be that in that chaos, a new dark force could rise, like a new MCU villain, a cosmic entity like Galactus, or a nightmarish interdimensional force like Nightmare, rumored to be the villain of the next Doctor Strange movie. So if you have some lingering doubts about the way Avengers Endgame left the MCU timeline, maybe those doubts could actually be the questions that set up the circumstances for future stories in Marvel Phase 4. But my question for you is, which timeline would you prefer to be the main MCU history going forward? The one we're currently with, the post-Endgame 5 years later future with mostly everyone still alive, minus Tony Stark, Black Widow, and Cap's an old man, or that other history I described, the one without Thanos in it, and we're just kind of left with the